Now we're up to Daf Lamed Hey Amid Beis. Ve'inami, another way of determining whether the tefillin are new or old, and again, according to Rashi, we're more machmer in new tefillin, is called Hechi Dechi Misle Be B'Misna. If he pulls the tefillin by the strap on one side, and then he has somebody else pulling the strap on the other side, Aisi Abasraisa Chadita. In other words, the tefillin, in the case of Chadita, which are new pairs of tefillin, then you could, in a kind of a tug of war situation, you could tug the tefillin towards you, right? By holding onto the strap, you could pull it towards you. And even though, someone else is pulling the tefillin in the opposite direction, so then he has the ability to pull it towards him. So each person, I guess, depending upon how much strength he puts into it, can pull it in one direction or the other. But vidachatikta, if it doesn't go like that, and because the old tefillin are brittle, and it's going to tear if two people tug in opposite directions. A new one, on the other hand, will simply be drawn towards the stronger person. So if you want to determine whether the tefillin are new or young, new or old, I should say, you'll have to gauge what happens in a tug of war. Weiter. Abai Avi Yosef coming to Yosef, Abai sitting in front of Yosef, Ifsik Leira to the tefillah, and a strap of his tefillin tore apart. Omol le. So Abai turns to his Rebbe of Yosef and he says, Ma'ale Miktare. What's the law here? Can I sew up the two pieces together of my strap? Omol le nein. You can't do that. Ukshartam ksiv. Shetehei kshira tama. It should be a perfect binding. And if you start binding it because it ripped, that's not going to be, even if you stitch it up and everything else, that's not a perfect binding. Can't achieve the original by stitching it up. Amalei Rav Acha Breder of Yosef Rav Ashi Ma'u lemispere v'ailu l'tfira legavo. So let's say his tefillin have a tear in it. Is he allowed to stitch it up? Bringing stitching to the inside of the strap so that the stitching is not obvious on the outside. Omer Rav Ashi says to Rav Acha, Puk chazi mai amadvar. And again, we're going to have my major machlokas to one extreme or the other amongst the commentaries. But literally speaking, Puk chazi mai amadvar means when we have a suffix, let's go out to the street and check the average rank and file citizen, see the way he does it. How do people conduct themselves? And according to Rashi's pshat, no one out there has stitched up leather straps, which were ripped, and then he stripped it in the back, and then he stitched it in the back. So therefore, don't wear these tefillin that have stitching on the inside of the strap. Omar Papa, gardume ritzuos ksheros. What about if part of the ritzuos were ripped off? So you're left with a minimum amount of the ritzua, and the question is, what's the shear? What's the minimum amount that's kosher for a ritzua? Certainly, in the case of a shel rosh, the minimum of minimums is that he has a ritzua that covers the head and then ends up in the keshet tefillin. But beyond that, how low down do they have to stretch? Lav milsi. In other words, the Gemara rejects Rav Papa to say that on an absolute way that gardumos, being cut ritzuos, are kosher. Midaka Amri b'nei Rabbi Chia, the sons of Rabbi Chia, stated that gardume tcheles v'gardume ezov ksherin. There were two categories of gardumin which, according to Rabbi Chia, were kosher. and tefillin is not on the list. They're either tcheles, meaning of tzitzis, or gardume ezov ksherim. The Torah requires that part of the purification of a mitzorah that you do something with hesap, which is called in Hebrew ezov. Chazal see that ezov is hanova, it's a small shrug, a low shrug. Hasamhu, and I'll tell you why in those two cases, Reb Chia was mekil, or bnei Reb Chia, because it's tashmishe mitzvah ninu. So whether it's the case of the hyssop that's used in the purification of the mitzorah, or it's cheles for the purpose of tzitzis, that's only tashmishe mitzvah. There's no inherent kedusha. However, in the case of tefillin, the tashmishe kedusha ninu lo. We're not going to be mekil on tefillin that have an inner sanctity, because anything that has words from the Torah itself gets kiddush saguf, inherent sanctity, like Sefer Torah, like tefillin, like mezuzahs. In any event, Michlal, we see from this dialogue here that the isplay shira. So what is kama shira? What is the minimum amount of gardume ritzuos, that what has to be left intact of the straps, how much, in order that the tefillin are still kosher? Okay, now we get, again, the trouble with this sugi is that there are so many different shitos. Omar Rami Bar Chomer Reish Lakish ad etzva tzroda. The amount, or the extent, the length, I guess you could say, of the straps of gardumim that absolutely have to be intact is until the etzba tzroda. Now, the way I understand it, we're talking about the index finger and the thumb. And that's a chumrah. Why is that a chumrah? Because the stretch of space between the index and the thumb is greater, is longer than the stretch between, let's say, the index finger and the middle finger. However, Tosfos disagrees with Rashi's pshat, and he's going to learn that tzroda is a reference to the middle finger. And therefore, trasa dida means that the middle finger is the rival of the index finger. So let's see if it comes clearer as the Gemara goes along. Rav Kahana Michve Kafuf and Rav Ashi Machve Poshut. Rav Kahana indicated that with his hand that the length of the part of the strap hanging from the knot, right? So you have the knot, which is the keshel tefillin, and then you have the straps that come down it, must be at least equal to the distance between his index finger and his middle finger when they're spread apart. Now, I'm not sure why the word kafuf is here, but we'll see the Gemara later on. It'll discuss that, and that's called kafuf. But Rav Ashi indicated a straight measure, 16. He says here in the note that the length of the strap hanging from the knot must be equal to this between the thumb and the index finger when they're spread apart. That's significantly, this will support what I said, significantly larger than Rav Kahana's measure of kafuf. Yeah, it's probably twice the amount. And the Gemara calls it straight as opposed to curved. He says here that a leather strap stretched in a straight line from point A to point B loses distance from end to end when it is shaped into a curve. Now we have a whole issue about whether these halachas apply to a tefillin shel yad as well. Rabba kotalahu uposhit b'shodilahu. Wow. This is so foreign to us that a Rabbah would take the ritzuas of the rush and throw them over his back. Rav Achbar Yaakov kotelahu, this is also strange to us, umetalilahu. He would put the tefillin on his head, and then he would take the two ritzuos that came down from the kesher, and he would braid them, make braids out of them. However, here's where we're familiar with it. Mar breder avana, ovid kididan. In other words, the straps of tefillin would be lying on the front of his body. Omar Rabbi Yehuda breder of Shmuel bar Shilas mishmei derav. Kesher shel tefillin halacha Moshe Sinai. Another case of halacha Moshe tefillin. It's the kesher shel tefillin. Omar Rav Nachman v'noyeim lebar. Noyeim, noy, is ornamentation. And lebar, as we said many times, is for the outside. I think there was a havamina that the keshel tefillin would be turned in the other direction. It would be facing the inside. But we don't have it like that. Ravashi Avi Yosef Kamidimar Zutra is hapich luritu the tefillin amalelo sover mar v'noyem lebar. Right, so his ritzus of his tefillin became inverted, and he asked them immediately, does the master not hold that, according to the tradition of Nachman, that it has to be outward? I wasn't aware of it. I wouldn't pay attention. Now that you pointed out to me, I'm going to make sure that the ritzus hang in the proper direction, facing outward. Okay, now we have a little bit of an agadata. A very famous agadata on a pasuk in the end of the Torah in Dvarim Perek Chav Ches. It says, "V'ro kol amei ha'aretz ki shem Hashem nikra alecha v'yaro b'meka." Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Gadol Omer elu tefillin shel rosh. Simple pshat is the tefillin shel yad are covered and the tefillin shel rosh are exposed. So if it says that the nations of the world will see the name of God and they will fear you, they will see the name of God on the tefillin shel rosh, not the tefillin shel yad, which they don't even see. Then, with regard to the keshel tefillin, v'asirosi as kapi v'ra isa sachorai, Hashem responds to Moshe's request to see his glory, the glory of Hashem. He says, I'll remove my hand and you will see my back. Omer Rav Chana bar Bizam Rab Shimon Chasida. Melamed sheherlo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe keshel tefillin. This is based on a Gemara in Brachos, a Daf Vav, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wears tefillin. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe Rabbeinu the tefillin, the kesher shel tefillin. Omer Rabbi Yehuda keshel tefillin tzarich sheyehei lemala. In other words, it shouldn't be lower down on the neck. Kideshu Yisrael lemala v'lamat is symbolic meaning that the keshel tefillin represents Klal Yisrael in their relationship with the nations of the world, and therefore we want it to be lemala, right? Not lower down on the neck. V'tzarich sheyeh klapi pnim, right? The keshel tefillin should be positioned outside and opposite the face of the spectator. Kadesh Yisrael Lifnim, another symbolic measure, V'lo lachar, that the Jewish people should be in the forefront and not in the rear. Omer Rab Shmuel bar Bideri, Omer Rab, no, the whole list of puzzles. Anyway, Tefillin, Memasai, Mevarech Aleim, and this is the sugya called over Lasiyosan, and we always make the bracha before the Maisa Mitzvah, and he should make the bracha Mishas Hanachosa, meaning after he puts them on. Eini, could that be so? Vam Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel, very famous principle in Birchas HaMitzvahs, that Kol Mitzvahs Kul Baruch Aleim over Lasiyosan, you make the bracha before you put it on. So how can you tell me that first he puts on the tefillin and then he makes the bracha? It would not be over Lasiyosan. What was this ruling of all those Amoraim? It was after he places the shel yad on his arm, upper arm, but he hasn't yet tightened it. So it's over Lasiyosan because the Torah says, Ukshartem lios hayadechem. And finally, here on the top of Daf Lamed Vav, Amar Rav Chizda, Sach bein tefila letefila, chozer mevarech. Simple pshat in this Gemara is that the brach on the tefillin shel yad has to cover him for the tefillin shel rosh, and therefore he cannot be mafsik and talk about whatever between the bracha on the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh. So the Gemara immediately is medayek. Sach in, lo sach lo. Are you telling me that if he wasn't mafsik between the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh, then he doesn't have to make a bracha on the tefillin shel rosh, meaning the bracha on the tefillin shel yad covers him even for the tefillin shel rosh. That can't be. V'hashalach Rav Chia, Breder, Rav Huna, Mishmei, Rav Yochanan, al tefillah shel yad omer, Baruch Asher Kisharim Tzolsono, Laniach tefillin al tefillin shel rosh omer, Baruch Asher Kisharim Tzolsono, mitzvah tefillin. And the simple pshat is that, as a general rule, he always has to make a separate bracha, an additional bracha on the tefillin shel rosh. So how can you tell me that it's only if sach bein tefillah, only if he spoke out, a baiver of the Amitzvah lo sach mevarech lo sach mevarech achas sach. I'm sorry, lo sach mevarech achas. He can stretch over the bracha from the tefillin shel yad to cover the tefillin shel rosh if there was no sicha, but sach if he spoke out between the tefillin shel rosh and tefillin shel yad, then mevarech shtayim. He's got to make two brachos. But again, it would seem from this Gemara that if there was no sicha between the two, one bracha would suffice, and that bracha would cover him for the tefillin shel rosh as well. Okay, then. So this is where we stop. Wishing you a great week.